A Social History of Anthropology in the United States by Thomas C. Patterson. Chapter 1, Anthropology in the New Republic, 1776 to 1879. The anthropological tradition that developed in the United States in the wake of the Revolutionary War was shaped by three overriding concerns: creating a national identity, episodic westward expansion, the settlement of Indian territories, and consolidating a slave-based economy in the southern states. Since the American writers who produced this tradition were themselves products of a milieu shaped by colonial expansion and the rise of industrial capitalism, they were already quite familiar with the arguments of European advocates and critics of those circumstances. The Americans read the same books, were familiar with the same bodies of social thought, and participated in the same debates as their contemporaries in Europe. This meant that they variously drew inspiration from the Bible as a source of historical information, from writers who proclaimed the immaturity or degeneration of the New World and its inhabitants, from the Enlightenment writers who argued that human society had progressed through a succession of different modes of subsistence, culminating in the commercialism of an emerging capitalist civilization. It also meant that the Americans held a range of opinions about the nature, diversity, and history of humanity. Like many of their contemporaries, they tended to see peoples or nations distinguished from one another by differences of language, custom, and physical condition. The Early Republic, 1776 to 1838. In the wake of the Revolution, it was imperative for Americans to assert not only their national identity, but also their capacity to develop a civil and political society that was morally superior to those of European countries. At the same time, they had to refute the arguments of 18th century writers, such as the influential French naturalist Georges Louis Leclerc, the Comte de Buffon, who asserted the inferiority of the New World, its inhabitants, and their societies. Buffon and his followers raised a political question of vital importance. Would the American experiment fail because of the obstructions imposed by nature? It was essential for the American envoys, such as Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, or Thomas Jefferson, to refute Buffon and his followers in the 1770s and the 1780s if they were to obtain sorely needed financial assistance and credit in Europe. They had to show that nature was neither hostile nor immutable in the Americas, and that the United States was indeed a good risk. In natural history, Buffon had claimed the main difference between the Old and New Worlds lay their geological age. Since the American continents were younger, in his view, nature was simultaneously less active and more severe than it was in the Old World. Their mountains were higher, their environments wilder and more inaccessible, their animals smaller. Even domesticated animals transported from Europe became smaller with the passage of time. Only snakes and insects truly thrived in the New World. The inert condition of nature, which favored the growth of lower creatures, such as snakes and insects, prevented the development of higher organisms. Thus, nature had also affected the American Indians, who were relatively newcomers, thinly scattered across these hostile lands. Buffon wrote that, even those which, from the kindly influence of another climate, have acquired their complete form and expansion, shrink and diminish in a niggardly sky and unprolific land, thinly peopled with wandering savages, who, instead using this territory as master, had no property or empire, and having subjected neither the animals nor the elements, nor conquered the seas, nor directed the motions of rivers, nor cultivated the earth, held only the first rank among animate beings, and existed as creatures of no consideration in nature, a weak automatons, incapable of improving or fruiting her intentions. She treated rather like a stepmother than a parent, denying them the invigorating sentiment of life, a strong desire of multiplying their species. It is easy to discover the cause of scattered life of savages, and their estrangement from society. They have been refused the most precious spark of nature's fire. They have no ardor for women, and of course, no love of mankind. For Buffon, the American Indians failed to develop a civil and political institutions, civilization, because of their own weakly developed nature and passive acceptance of their surroundings. However, the European settlers in the Americas had already begun to conquer and transform nature. Subsequent writers frequently misrepresented Buffon's views by focusing exclusively on the indifference and harshness of nature in the New World. It was their opinions, such as those of Buffon, that scientists and natural philosophers in the United States sought to refute. The more prominent critics of Buffon and his followers were affiliated with the American Philosophical Society, which had been founded at the urging of Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia in 1943 to promote useful knowledge among the British plantations in America. While Franklin countered their arguments, citing evidence of the rapid growth of the English population in North America in the 18th century, and Madison commented on climatic changes brought about by clearing land in Virginia. Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia was a lengthy, detailed response which brought to bear a wide range of evidence, including discovery of mammoth bones in Ohio, as well as ethnological, linguistic, and archaeological information that he and others had collected over the years to support his claims. Jefferson argued that nature was equal in the Old and New Worlds. Since nature was bountiful in the Americas, both the English settlers and the Indians, who were essentially the same race or people in his eyes, were able to realize their potential. His response was based on the theory of nature that resembled those of Enlightenment writers, such as Claude Helvetius or Sam Smith. In France and Scotland, he believed that human beings possessed the same innate moral sense, capacity to reason, and biological needs. All men are created equal, and human nature was on the same on every side of the Atlantic. While human nature was the same everywhere, it was only realized in society. As a result, the differences that existed between societies resulted in their environmental circumstances and the stage they had achieved in development of civilization. The American Indians were not distinguished from Europeans by differences in morality, intelligence, and strength, and their skin color was only slightly different from that Europeans who lived in the Mediterranean. What did distinguish the Indians from their English-speaking neighbors in Virginia was that they hunted while the latter farmed. In other words, their level of social development resembled that of Europeans living north of the Alps at the time of the Roman Empire. However, since human nature was also plastic, if Indians adopted agriculture, then their cultures would meet, intermix, and blend together the more highly developed culture of European settlers. In 1784, legislation proposed in Virginia that promised free education, tax relief, and monetary credits to promote marriage between Americans of European descent and the indigenous population. While Jefferson believed that the differences between Indian and European were superficial, a matter of environment and history rather than biology, he did not extend the same argument to either women or blacks. He claimed, like St. Paul and the Puritans, and unlike Helvetius or Mary Wollstonecraft, that women as a group possess less reasoning power than men, and therefore they should be encouraged to refine their aesthetic and moral endowments. Jefferson, the slave owner, ever fearful of a slave revolt and condemning the institution itself, at least in his early years, recognized that the condition of slaves was miserable. He also suspected that the blacks, who he believed were moral equals of whites, lacked their powers and reasons and imagination. Black slaves, he argued, were less creative and innovative than the Roman slaves who lived under more audacious circumstances. The difference he could discern was that the slaves of Rome were white. His conclusion, usually hedged with qualifications, was that the conditions of women and blacks were innate, a consequence of their nature and biology rather than the circumstances in which they lived. Thus, Jefferson's views on human nature contained contradictions. If human nature was portrayed as mutable in his discussions of American Indians, then it was fixed and immutable as far as women and blacks were concerned. If he implied his discussions of Indians and whites, not to mention in his political declarations, that all human beings belong to the same species, then his writings about blacks implied that races of humanity existed, and they existed in a hierarchy if they were not actually separate species. If his discussions of the Indians and their accomplishments vindicated the American environment, then his remarks about Afro-Americans justified slavery, and his comments about women condoned inequality by excluding them from political debate. Jefferson and his contemporaries held a highly political view of language. In their view, language was distinctively a human attribute that made communication possible. Some linked the origin of language to the Old Testament and saw it as originating when Adam gave names to the various animals, and diversifying when God confounded the tongues spoken by the people who built the Tower of Babel and dispersed them across the face of the earth. For others, such as Jefferson himself and Noah Webster, who followed the views of John Locke, languages were not God-given, but merely assemblages of utterances that signified particular ideas for their speakers. More importantly, however, they reflected the unique social and intellectual experience of those speakers. Thus, a nation's language reflected its history, and studying things pertaining to its words was a way of gaining insight into both the history of the nations and the history of humanity itself. Jefferson believed that a knowledge of American Indian languages would certainly provide evidence of their origins. How many ages have elapsed since the English, Dutch, the Germans, the Swiss, and the Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes have separated from their common stock? Yet how many more must elapse before proofs of their common origin, which exist in their several languages, will disappear? This is to be lamented, then, that we have suffered so many Indian tribes to extinguish without having previously collected and deposited in records of literature the rudiments, at least of the languages they spoke. Were vocabularies formed in all language spoken in North and South America, preserving their implementations of most common objects in nature, of those which must be present to every nation, barbarous or civilized, with the inflection of their nouns and verbs, their principles of regimen and concord. It would furnish opportunities for those skilled in languages in the Old World to compare them with these, and to construct the best evidence of the derivation of this part of the human race. Jefferson had already connected enough information about the Indian languages to convince himself that they were more diverse than those of the Old World. In fact, he argued, the inhabitants of nearby villages in North America often spoke different languages. He took this to mean that their separation was quite ancient. Thus, by the late 1780s, Jefferson, Benjamin Smith, Barton, and the others began to collect vocabularies and other ethnological information from various American Indian groups. In 1786, President George Washington asked government agents in Ohio to collect Indian vocabularies which could be added to those already collected by Peter Pallas and would throw light upon the original history of this country and forward researches into probably connections between the northern parts of America and those of Asia. Such an affinity of tongues, he believed, would show that human differences were superficial, that all nations ultimately had the same origin, and that they were subject to some fundamental way to the same laws of nature. Similar requests were made over the next 30 years by Jefferson and others, and vocabularies of a number of American Indian languages were published. The most widely cited of the early compilations was Benjamin Smith Barton's New Views of the Origin of Tribes and Nations of America, in which he compared the other languages of North and South American tribes with those of the Old World, in order to show that they had common origin. By 1811, vocabularies of 83 American Indian languages existed. Much of the information recording Indian languages was assembled by Peter S. du Ponceau, Historical Literary Committee of the American Philosophical Society, which was established with Jefferson's support in 1815. The main differences with much of this early work was that the authors could not indicate the sounds of vowels and consonants, and that they did not produce an adequate classification of the historical or genetic relationships of American Indian languages similar to the one constructed by William Jones for the Indo-European languages. In 1819, former President John Adams encouraged Dupancourt to follow Jones in his study in American Indian languages. Dupancourt did so. In his view, the languages spoken from Greenland to Tierra del Fuego were remarkably similar to one another. They shared complex structures and grammatical forms that distinguished them from all the Old World languages. He called this distinctive feature polysynthesis. The polysynthetic languages, which existed only in the Americas, were a more effective system than their Old World counterparts by combining the greatest number of ideas in the least number of words. According to Dupancourt, this reflected the superior intellect of the inventors of the American Indian languages. It was also ample proof that these languages were neither degenerate nor primitive. In fact, Old World languages that were structurally closest to them, Latin, Greek, and Slavic, had been spoken by those Europeans who had given rise to civilization itself. Dupancourt's classification of American Indian languages underpinned all subsequent efforts in the 19th century to investigate their historical and genetic connections. His portrayal of American Indian languages countered the claims that culture could not flourish in the United States. He suggested instead that these languages, remnants of the past age, and the American English were worthy of study in their own right. They could provide the foundations for a truly national literature. Dupancourt was not only the American writer with a political view of language and aesthetics. In 1780, John Adams proposed to the Continental Congress that it establish a national language academy in order to promote the achievements of the new nation. While this academy could encourage the study of all language and literatures, it would promote, correct, and improve American English. It would refine the language in a way that the English were unable to do because of their diverse regional and class dialects. The elaboration of American English would not only manifest the political ideology of the United States, but would also enhance its standing in the community of nations. Noah Webster summarized in Adams' views 9 years later when he wrote that customs, habits, and language, as well as government, should be national. America should have her own distinct from all the world. Such is the policy of other nations. Such must be our policy, before the state can either be independent or respectable. Adams and Webster were just two of the Americans clamoring for the development of a national language. Benjamin Franklin, focusing his attention on the relation between spoken and written word, had long advocated uniform spelling and clear, easily typefaces that would make learning the language easier and facilitate its spread in the marketplace. He also saw the economic benefits of such reforms. The general use of the French language has likewise very advantageous effect on the profits of bookselling branch of commerce. It is being well known that the more copies can be sold that are struck off from one composition of types, the profits increase in much greater proportion than they do in making a greater number of pieces in any other kind of manufacture. While Congress never established the National Language Academy favored by the Federalists of New England, Webster's and others did launch institutes in Boston and New York devoted to the study of philology and belles lettres. However, more important than these short-lived language academies for the formation of a national language and literature was the fact that American nationalism intensified and became more complex after the War of 1812. It was marked by the publication of dictionaries explicitly concerned with American English by the appearance of the influential North American Review in 1815 and the rapid development of a consciously American literature through the writings of James Fenimore Cooper, Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, and other authors. Many of the defining works of this national literature dealt with the violence of settler expansion into the Indian homelands in upstate New York and the areas of West Alphegues. Plans for expansion into the Indian territories west of the Appalachians began a week after the end of the hostilities with England in April 1783. However, the country had no Indian policy until the Constitution was ratified in 1789. Until then, it was largely a hope shaped by the need to have European states view the Americans as moral, just, and responsible people. Washington had initially wanted the Revolutionary War veterans to settle in the western lands in order to protect the frontier. He presumed incorrectly that the tribes would cede or sell land to settlers. This was not the case. In 1801, Jefferson adopted the policies that encouraged Indians to become farmers in order to obtain new land for settlers. On numerous occasions, he advocated intermarriage to reduce friction between the two and destroy the distinction between savage and civilized people. However, by 1809, this policy was actively opposed by Tecumseh, who argued for the common ownership of land by all tribes so that no one group could cede land, and by his brother Texequatawa and the Shawnee prophet, who advocated casting off white civilization altogether. As settlers moved into Indian territories, tensions rose, and the tribes in both the South and Old Northwest became increasingly hostile. While the Indians viewed the settlers as unwanted intruders, the frontiersmen increasingly saw the Indians as savages who impeded their quest for land. In the words of Lewis Cass, who would become one of the leading architects of the federal Indian policy in the 1820s and the 1830s, the Indians were unchangeable in their physical and moral habits, unable to appreciate their own condition, and resistant to education and other attempts to ameliorate their circumstances. In short, the Indians were like nomads, incapable of achieving civilization on their own or of learning from others. The westward expansion of the United States occurred in bursts, each of which led to a long period of intensified interest in American Indian tribes. For example, after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore newly acquired territory. He requested that they obtain ethnological information from each of the tribes they encountered regarding their health, morals, religion, history, subsistence activities, warfare, amusements, clothing, and customs. In the early 1820s, Lewis Cass, then territorial governor and superintendent of Indian Affairs in Michigan, compiled several lengthy questionnaires concerned with ethnological and linguistic matters that he sent to traders, military commanders, and Indian agents. In Cass's view, the frontier ethnology would provide a justification for the government's new Indian policies and corrective theories of Dupunku. Henry R. Schoolcraft, an Indian agent in Sault Ste. Marie for many years, provided Cass with much information. He echoed his sentiments about depravity of American Indians and defended the policy of removing Indian tribes from their homelands to the areas west of the Mississippi River. As settlers and land spectators poured into the valleys of the Ohio River and its tributaries, towns were established. Local antiquarians such as Caleb Antiwater surveyed antiquities of the region and recorded the presence of numerous ancient mounds and earthworks. Who built the mounds was a question they repeatedly asked. Atwater thought that the Ohio earthworks owed their origin to the people far more civilized than our Indians, but far less so than Europeans. This conclusion was reiterated a few years later by William Henry Harrison, who became the first president of the West. This theory separated the contemporary Indian tribes from the deeds of their ancestors and challenged their right as independent nations to possess the lands they occupied. Depictions of Indians as hunters and foragers were also a threat to claim their lands. Such arguments also resonated with John Locke's arguments of the second test of government. As you will recall, Locke vested the origin of land property in the labor that persons invested in the land to provide their own consumption. While farmers transformed the land through their labor, hunters and foragers did not. Hence, the latter had no natural right to their unimproved lands. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Marshall wrote the brief in Johnson and Graham's Less versus McIntosh, which denied that the Indians possessed an unqualified right to their lands and vested the right instead in the settlers who discovered those lands. This case provided the legal grounds for removing eastern tribes from their lands, including groups such as the Cherokee that altered their circumstances to become farmers. In 1830, the federal government removed the Cherokee from their lands in Georgia and sent them on a death march known as the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. Newspaper editor and abolitionist John Greenleaf Whittier, among others, immediately protested the government's policy. He wrote that the present policy of our government toward the unfortunate Cherokee is one of unparalleled cruelty. The curse of slavery is enough to seal our eternal infamy. The unjust evictment of Indians will be a crime which men may never forget, nor eternal justice forgive. Americans were aware of the cultural and physical diversity of people who lived in the new republic. A number of them sought to identify who the Americans were and who they were becoming in ways that would enhance the nation's standing in the eyes of European countries. These were the questions about slavery, morality, and politics, as much as they were about race and environment. Slavery had had a profound effect on the political debate before, during, and after the Revolution. The calls of Sons of Liberty for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, property, were also heard by slave populations in Virginia and the Carolinas. On the eve of the war, slave owners feared a slave uprising. Fuel was added to these fears in 1775 when the royal governor of Virginia issued a proclamation granting the lifelong freedom to any slaves who could escape and would bear arms against American rebels. Most of the escaped slaves fought for the British. The rest took shelter with Indian tribes in the mountains and beyond. Perhaps 20% of the American slaves gained their freedom during the war, many whom immigrated to Nova Scotia in the 1780s because of the political climate that prevailed in the new country. In 1782, Hector de Crèvecoeur claimed that the Americans were a new race of men, partially because of the strange mixture of blood that existed in no other country, and partly because of the new mode of life they embraced. In 1787, Samuel Sainthorpe Smith, a moral philosopher and the president of Princeton University, wrote that the new race or nation was not so much a product of the intermixing as it was of Negroes and Indians being transformed into whites because of the new habits of living they were adopting. In his view, the descendants of the Europeans, the Indians, and the Negroes belonged to the same species. The variability in their appearance resulted in the influence of climate and differences in their state of society or habits of living. Given the plasticity of the human species, the climate and culture of America would make the members of all races of the new nation, including descendants of European workers and peasants, whiter. Thus, the state of society would augment or correct the influence of climate. However, his views would not overcome the inequalities brought on by slavery and laws. Not everyone, however, accepted the views that America was or should become a nation of mixed bloods. Benjamin Rush, a Philadelphia physician, signer of the Declaration and abolitionist, took a slightly different view of Smith. He too recognized the racial diversity of America on the eve of the Revolutionary War. Whites, Indians, and Negroes had distinctive racial characteristics. Indians, for example, exhibited no madness or melancholy and lacked envy because of the equality of power and property in their society. However, he believed that they had no future because of their intemperance with alcohol. Rush further argued that all the vices which were charged upon Negroes in southern colonies, such as idleness, treachery, theft, and the like, are the genuine offspring of slavery. The black color of their skin, he asserted, should not qualify them for slavery. Like his contemporaries, Rush was concerned with the cause of the black skin color he believed resulted from a disease. If this was true, then it could be cured. He identified the disease as leprosy, for which there was no cure at the time. Consequently, he advocated the separation of races to prevent the spread of disease. In 1792, Jonathan Edwards suggested the Abolition Society of Connecticut that the sins of slavery would necessitate a compensation, inconceivably more mortifying than the loss of their real estates, the mixture of their blood with that of the Negroes into one common posterity. No one, except Smith, thought that intermarriage was a solution of the problems of inequality and prejudice. Marriage between individuals of African and European heritage, which had not been uncommon in the late 17th century, had been banned in a number of colonies by 1700. The white Indian marriages called for by Jefferson and others in the 1780s actually took place in frontier areas. However, in the 1820s, the children of those unions faced growing discrimination as tensions mounted along the frontier, as settlers and their political agents increasingly portrayed them as savages incapable of being civilized, and clamored for the implementation of Indian removal policies. Such views would soon spawn a large literature on hereditary and social nature of hybrids. Others followed Edward Long, whose History of Jamaica and views on the racial inferiority of African slaves were sterilized in the Columbian Magazine in 1788. He and the English physician Charles White claimed that the racials were actually represented in regular gradations of humanity. In their view, Europeans were the highest, most advanced grade, while Africans were the lowest and least developed. In White's view, anatomical differences, such as differences in morality and intellect, distinguished the Europeans from the more ape-like Negro. Still others flirted with Lord Kames' vague suggestion that the various races were actually separate species. Such views, combined with anti-miscegenation laws, buttressed the views of James Madison, who believed that the removal of freed slaves from Virginia was necessary because the repugnance of the white to their continuance among them was founded on prejudices themselves, founded on physical distinctions, and which are not likely soon, if ever, to be eradicated. The idea of Negro removal was widespread in Virginia in the 1970s. By 1805, any freedman or woman who did not leave the state within 1 year faced re-enslavement. Neighboring states such as Ohio, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware soon enacted legislation that banned African Americans from entering to take up permanent residence. From the perspective of these legislators, the new republic would be a white nation. Former slaves could return to Africa, which many of them did when Liberia was established in 1847. Race and Manifest Destiny in Industrializing America, 1838 to 1879. The idea of white racial superiority became an increasingly prominent feature of everyday discourse in America during the 1830s and the 1840s. It gained momentum after the citizens of Georgia seized Indian lands, displaced their residents, and extended the institution of slavery into the new territory, thereby linking Indians and African slaves in the same discourse. John Quincy Adams and others believed events like this were bound to happen, because the two races were inexorably fixed at lower stages of social development, savagery in the case of Indians, and somewhere between pastoralism and primitive agriculture for the Africans. They were signs of their inferior, insubordinate status and position in a racial hierarchy topped by native-born Anglo-Saxon Protestants. At the same time, they buttressed the ideology of manifest destiny, which viewed American expansion as evidence of the innate superiority of the American Anglo-Saxon branch of the Caucasian race, which was a separate, innately superior people who were destined to bring good government, commercial prosperity, and Christianity to the American continents and the rest of the world. These sentiments were fueled by rising resentment against the torrent of Irish Catholic immigrants coming to America and by the war looming on the horizon with Mexico over land claims west of the Mississippi. By 1840, many politicians and social commentators had come to believe that the cultural differences exhibited by Indians and Africans on the one hand and the Anglo-Saxon Americans on the other were rooted in biology. In their view, the different races of humanity formed a natural hierarchy topped by native-born white Protestants. They argued that the different races possessed varying degrees of intellect. For Charles Cladwell, America's leading phrenologist in the 1830s, these differences were manifested in the shape and the size of their crania and brains. The brain, for phrenologists, was composed of individual faculties that controlled personality, thought, and moral action, that the strength of these facilities could be determined by protuberances on the skull, and that each race manifested its cultural traits through the shape of the cranium. Cladwell had earlier criticized Samuel Santhrop Smith's claims that all human beings belong to the same species, and that the differences in skin color resulted from the interaction of the bile with heat and humidity. For Cladwell, the four races of humanity, Caucasians, Mongolians, Indians, and Africans, were actually separate species distinguished from one another by the quality of their intellects and minds, which could, of course, be determined by inspecting the size and the shape of their skulls. The Anglo-Saxons were, for Cladwell, the most endowed variety of the Caucasian race, that the inhabitants of the United States, being also the best Caucasian stock, promised to be even more productive than the Britons of further ages. While Cladwell was a minor, relatively unimportant figure in the history of American science, his fascination with race and intellect inspired Samuel G. Morton, Philadelphia physician and corresponding secretary of the Academy of Natural Sciences, whose investigations were at the center of American ethnological research in the late 1830s and early 1840s, to amass one of the world's largest collections of human crania, many of which were purchased from grave robbers and collectors on the frontier. His goal was to create an objective, scientific assessment of the racial differences in skull size and shape, which he believed underpinned behavioral differences. While the more cautious than Cladwell, he also believed that phrenology provided an excellent indication of national traits. Morton accepted Johann Blumenbach's earlier racial classification, which was based on differences in skull form and skin color. For Blumenbach, there were 5 races: Caucasian, Ethiopian, Mongolian, American Indian, and African. However, Morton rejected Blumenbach's claim that racial diversity resulted from the degeneration of the original Caucasian racial type as peoples migrated into new environments, ate new foods, and coped with their new circumstances. The problem for Morton was that he accepted a biblical chronology, which placed the age of Earth at less than 6,000 years. Both Caucasians and Africans were represented in Egyptian monuments that were sculpted more than 3,000 years ago. In his view, there was simply too little time in human history for one race to have evolved from another. This meant that racial differences, such as intellect or color, were permanent. Morton's path-breaking Crania Americana was more than an attempt to explain the differences between the levels of development in the demi-civilized Indians of Mexico and Peru and the mound builders, all of who farmed, and the remaining barbarous tribes in North and South America, whose members subsisted by hunting and foraging. He made 13 different measurements on each of the 256 skulls he accumulated to show that there was a gradation in the average brain size of the 5 races. He argued that Caucasians had the largest cranial capacities, followed by Mongolians, Malays, American Indians, and Ethiopians, descending in order. In his view, the behavioral differences between various races were primordial, not acquired. The American Indians, for example, had not adopted a civilized manner of life from their Caucasian neighbor because of the limited mental capacities manifested by their smaller brain sizes. His measurements showed that, excepting the Eskimo, the American Indians were indeed a distinct race composed of 2 families, the demi-civilized Totelkin, whose tribes farmed, and the American, whose tribes hunted. This implied that the mound builders belonged to a different family from that of the tribes that historically occupied the Ohio River Valley. In Crania Aegyptiaca, Morton extended his investigations with measurements on more than 100 skulls removed from the tombs in Egypt and sent to him by George Gliddon, the American consul in Cairo. He concluded from this study that the differences between Caucasian and Negro cranial capacities that existed for more than 3,000 years. This supported, he believed, his claims about the permanency of certain racial characteristics. Furthermore, he asserted that inhabitants of ancient Egypt, the cradle of civilization, were neither Caucasian nor Negro. They were instead a mixture of several distinct branches of the human family: the Caucasian, the Semitic, the Austro-Egyptian, and the Negro. Furthermore, since the ancient Egyptians enslaved peoples they conquered, the Negroes must have been slaves. Southern politicians and slave owners delighted in this conclusion and saw it as a vindication of their own social practices. Morton raised questions about the status of race. If the races were, in fact, separate species, as some had already claimed, then why were the offspring of Indian white and Negro white matings fertile and able to produce children of their own? Morton's answer was that morphological differences were ancient and fixed. Josiah Clark Knott, a Philadelphia-trained physician from Alabama, took a different tack. He dropped the criterion of fertility, arguing that Caucasians and Negroes were morphologically distinct species that possessed different susceptibilities to disease. He produced evidence reportedly showing that individuals with mixed race heritage, such as mulattoes, experienced higher mortality and shorter life expectancies than individuals of either parent race. This echoed a claim made a year earlier by Edward Jarvis, a Southern physician who argued that the incidence of insanity was 10 times greater among free Negroes in the North than among slave populations in the South. From this, Jarvis deduced that slavery must have had a wonderful influence upon the development of moral faculties and intellectual powers of the individual. In other words, both Knott and Jarvis claimed that there was a direct lineage between race and health. As the American expansion westward proceeded during the 1840s, American travelers increasingly portrayed the peoples of Mexico's northern provinces as mixed or mongrel race with considerable Indian blood. In California, this race was unfit to control the destinies of that beautiful country, since its members were scarcely a visible grade, in scale of intelligence, above the barbarous tribes by whom they were surrounded. Stereotypes such as these were ruthlessly exploited by Presidents James Buchanan and others in their depictions of Mexicans during the 1840s, as they justified a war with Mexico in order to seize new land west of the Mississippi. The Mexicans, in their view, had failed to make the land bountiful. When the hostilities finally ended in 1848, the United States, which had already annexed Texas, now added New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and Atla, California to its national territory. If scientific racism had its roots in educational and cultural institutions of Philadelphia, then the cultural entrepreneurs of New England and Harvard College were the hotbed of ideology in the Anglo-Saxon superiority. Edward Everett, a Harvard professor, classical archaeologist, ambassador to England, Secretary of State, and editor of the North American Review, claimed that the Anglo-Saxon race, from which we Americans trace our descent, surpassed by none other that ever existed. These sentiments were shared by many of his Harvard colleagues, including eminent naturalist Louis Agassiz, who argued that the various races were indeed separate species and that they were arranged hierarchically with blacks at the bottom and whites at the top. After writing the introduction to Knott and Gliddon's widely reviewed Types of Mankind, published in 1854, Agassiz described the threat of health and physical disabilities of mixed races posed to civilization and morality. The views of Morton, Knott, and Agassiz, American polygenists, regarding the existence of racial hierarchy did not go unchallenged. African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass disputed them. He claimed that they misappropriated the peoples of ancient Egypt when they claimed them to be Europeans, and their civilization as European, rather than an African accomplishment. Douglass focused on the circumstances that underpinned their biological determinism. A racial hierarchy did exist in the United States. However, it was rooted in social and economic circumstances rather than physical or biological ones. Discrimination against blacks, Douglass argued, existed both legally and in the public mind because their skin color was linked with the degradation of slavery and servitude. He also pointed to the similarities between Negroes and the Irish who had begun to enter the United States in large numbers in the 1830s. Many of the Irish immigrants were unskilled laborers and servants who lived in urban slums. They occupied the lowest rung of a labor force that was increasingly stratified by ethnicity, race, and gender. They dug canals, mined coal, and toiled at various tasks that were deemed too dangerous for expensive slaves to undertake. During the Civil War, Agassiz advised the United States Sanitary Commission, which together with the Provost Marshal General's Bureau made anthropometric measurements of nearly 24,000 soldiers, sailors, Indians, mulattoes, and Negroes between 1863 and 1865 in order to refine their understanding of racial types and their differences. The Sanitary Commission was a semi-official organization composed of predominantly upper-class patrician elements in which have been vainly seeking a function in American society during the war. Its expenses were underwritten in a substantial part by insurance companies, along with other medical and anthropometric studies made in the 19th century. They were quickly used by insurance companies' statisticians to establish an empirical foundations for differential premium and rate structures based on race to verify their necessity. Morton, Knott, and other polygenists in the American School of Anthropology, such as Ephraim G. Squire, who were confident that anthropometric studies would yield a scientific understanding of human history. They had little confidence in historical reconstructions based on language comparisons. In their view, linguistics and philology were not exact sciences, because the language spoken by any people was likely to have been influenced by diverse circumstances. Morton liked to point out that the Mongols, Hindus, and Negroes who inhabited Madagascar spoke the same language. The other reason they shunned philological studies was that scholars who based their historical reconstructions on language also believed that humanity was a single species, that the physical attributes of a group were not causative, and that human behavior or culture was shaped by social and historical circumstances, and consequently was mutable rather than fixed. Albert Gallatin, the Jefferson Secretary of Treasury, diplomat, and one of the founders of the American Ethnological Society, was the most articulate spokesman and defender of Enlightenment views in the 1840s. Gallatin accepted as fact that humanity was indeed a single species, that the Indians of the North and South America were a single people, as the similarity of structural and grammatical forms of their languages showed, and that the nations of Mexico, Central America, and Peru had progressed from savagery toward civilization because they adopted agriculture and lived in environments that resembled Old World centers of civilization. He also did not believe that the contemporary American Indians of Ohio and the Mississippi River valleys had degenerated from an earlier stage of social development in which they farmed, as many antiquarians concerned with the ancient mound builders of the region had suggested. In his view, the mental abilities and moral feelings of Indians were products of their environment rather than their physical characteristics such as skin color. Gallatin's synopsis of the Indian tribes within the United States was the first systematic comparison of North American Indian languages. He made use of Dupanque's studies as well as information gleaned from a questionnaire concerned with vocabulary and grammar that the Secretary of War sent to Indian agents, travelers, and missionaries in 1826. He also mapped tribal locations and language distributions. Unlike Dupanque, however, who believed that the polysynthetic languages of American Indians were advanced, Gallatin argued that they were more primitive than ancient Greek. That is, they represented an earlier and hence older stage of historical development of language itself. As a result, the American Indian languages also had clues not only into the origins of language, but also about the development of human reason itself. Gallatin began his ethnological and philological studies in the 1820s at the same time as Lewis Cass and others were clamoring for the adoption of policies that would allow them to remove Indians from their homelands east of the Mississippi River. Unlike Cass, Gallatin believed that Indians need not be exterminated to facilitate the advance of American civilization. While he advocated buying Indian lands, he also recommended that the federal government create conditions on new reservations that would compel Indians to adopt agriculture. Moreover, the government should also promote education programs for their children in order to advance the cause of civilization. During the 1840s, when he was already in his 80s, Gallatin confronted an intellectual milieu that was increasingly sympathetic to theories of degeneration and polygenism. These theories were based on the belief of inferiority of non-Caucasian races. Gallatin addressed these theories indirectly in his last works, which considered whether civilization had developed independently in the Americas or was a consequence of diffusion. He believed that adoption of agriculture was the motor leading to the development of cities, arts, and the sciences. In his mind, the different traditions of mathematics and astronomy in Central America and Peru claimed the independent development of civilization in those regions. He was also intrigued by the reports describing agricultural societies in the American Southwest and wondered whether they resulted from compact or of diffusion of the peoples further south, or were again examples of independent development. By the 1850s, scholars who studied American Indian languages found it increasingly difficult to publish the results of their inquiries. The North American Review, which had been a major outlet earlier in the century, stopped publishing articles on Indian languages after 1860. Nevertheless, a society concerned with the study of language and languages had been formed in 1842 by classical and biblical scholars. It was the American Oriental Society, whose goals were to inquire into the history of literature of the civilized nations of the Orient and to cultivate the learning of Asian, African, and Polynesian languages. Its first president was John Pickering, who had produced an important survey of American Indian languages in 1830. However, in his opening address, Pickering scarcely mentioned their existence and focused instead on the need to compile materials for a general ethnography of the globe. For the Harvard-educated Pickering, who reviewed language as a distinctly human form of behavior, this meant studying language apart from the social context in which it occurred. William Dwight Whitney, professor of Sanskrit and comparative philology at Yale, made several significant contributions to the study of language and anthropology after the Civil War, as the publication of information about American Indian languages reached its nadir. A language such as English, in his view, was the immense aggregate of articulated signs for thought accepted by and current among a certain vast community, whose members speak its myriad of class and local varieties. While new dialects appeared among common peoples, and the speech of elites and lettered classes adhered to tradition, the same process of change, combination, and adaptation were actually occurring in both. The appearance of new forms and meanings depended on forgetting established historical connections, on the one hand, and on the other making new linkages between the thing signified and its spoken sign. The processes of combination and adaptation remained the same as the form of the language changed. Consequently, the prevailing analogies of composition used by its speakers to select new items were also transformed. Whitney was acutely aware of the social and political context in which a language change occurred. He pointed out that the sphere in which English was spoken was expanding rapidly precisely because of the social and political conditions that existed in the 19th century. In the United States, the spread of American English was displacing American Indian languages and reducing the linguistic diversity of the continent. He described this in the following way. As here, in America, a single cultivated nation of homogeneous speech is taking place as congeries of wild tribes with their hosts of discordant tongues, so, on a smaller scale, it is everywhere else. Civilization and condition it makes are gaining upon barbarism and its isolating influences. The implication of this was clear to Whitney. No individual's speech directly and necessarily marks his descent. It only shows what community he grew up. Language is no infallible sign of race. Like any other element of acquired civilization, it was transmitted from generation to generation, from community to community, from race to race. In the United States, Indians, Africans bought from their native slave homes, and Irish immigrants had by necessity learned American English and had been incorporated into that speech community. Thus, the fusion and replacement of languages was made possible when individuals who spoke different tongues were brought together in the same community. Like his contemporaries, Whitney was not particularly concerned with the study of American Indian languages. He believed that they were locked in a death struggle with the speakers of the American English for territory. As a Sanskrit scholar, he believed that the Indo-European languages were most developed in the sense of having undergone the process of combination and adaptation for the longest time. Furthermore, since written texts had survived from earlier stages in their development, it was possible to trace their history with longer degrees of certainty. While the interest in American Indian languages ebbed rapidly in the 1850s, concern with the American Indians continued unabated because of westward expansion and settlement after the war with Mexico. The identity of the mound builders continued to be the question asked most frequently. Were they a race of semi-civilized farmers that had disappeared, as Morton and Henry Harrison claimed, or were they merely ancestors of the contemporary Indian inhabitants of the region, as James McCall and Schoolcraft implied? The fact that the newly established Smithsonian Institution chose to publish was the E.G. Squire and Edwin H. Davis's lavishly illustrated Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, as the first volume of its publication series, Smithsonian Contributions to Knowledge, attested to the importance of that question. With the encouragement of Joseph Henry, renowned physicist and first secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Squire and Davis attempted to bring science to bear in order to resolve the question of the mound builder's identity. At the outset, they wrote, all preconceived notions were abandoned, and the work research commenced as if no speculations had been indulged in, nor anything before known, respecting the singular remains of antiquity scattered so profusely around us. It was concluded that either the field should be entirely abandoned to the poet and the romancer, or, if these monuments were capable of reflecting any certain light upon the grand archaeological questions connected with the primitive history of the American continent, the origin, migration, and early state of the American race, that then they should carefully and minutely, and above all, systematically investigated. As a result of their investigations, Squire and Davis felt that the contemporary American Indian tribes and their ancestors were incapable of constructing the mounds. They were erected instead by an ancient race that subsequently migrated to Mexico and that was replaced in the Mississippi River Valley by contemporary Indian tribes. In effect, Squire and Davis separated the contemporary inhabitants, who were portrayed as hunters and foragers, from the agriculturalists who built the mounds, and who had transformed the soil into means of production. Thus, Squire and Davis provided a reportedly scientific argument to support claims based ultimately on John Locke's second treatise, which vested the origin of landed property and labor. Any land cultivated by persons for their subsistence was a part of their property, as were the fruits they harvested from it for their own consumption. In 1849, Squire made the connection between property and race more clearly after President Zachary Taylor had sent him as a charge d'affaires to Central America, where he precipitated a war with England. Squire argued that Mosquito Indians of the Caribbean coast, whom the British supported, were a mixed race. The Mosquitoes have none of the conditions essential to nationality, according to the standards of common sense and the requirements of the laws of nations. An insignificant handful in respect to numbers, they wander along the parks and bays of the coast, obtaining a precarious subsistence from fishing and natural products of the earth. They are without fixed habitations, without a written language, without laws, the institution of marriage, or even a distinct idea of God. They have no conception of the responsibilities of government, nor are they capable of discharging its duties. These mixed race, he claimed, were inferior to the Indians of the United States in personal appearance and definitely below them in the mental scale. Consequently, in his view, the Mosquito certainly had no legitimate claim to land property in that country. Squire's arguments echoed the comments made earlier by John Lloyd Stephens, the renowned author of travel accounts, and President Martin Van Buren's representative to the crumbling Central American Federation in 1839. When he saw the Maya ruins at Copan, Stephens wrote that its monuments put at rest till once and forever in our minds all uncertainty in regard to the character of American antiquities, and gave us the assurance that the objects that we were in search were interesting, not only as the remains of an unknown people, but of works as art, and the people who once occupied the continent of America were not savages. In his view, the ruins at Copan reflected the artistic imagination of civilized men. Since the contemporary inhabitants of the region had no recollection of the ruins, he argued, the buildings must have been erected by an ancient civilization. This perspective added fuel to the idea of the mound-builder race, even though Stephens himself thought that they were built by the ancestors of the present-day Indians whose culture degenerated through time. Stephens suggested to Frederick Catherwood, his traveling companion, and the artist whose etching would make ancient Maya ruins famous, that they should, by Copan, remove the monuments of a bygone people from the desolate region in which they were buried, set them in the great commercial emporium, and found an institution that would be the nucleus of the great National Museum of American Antiquities. Stephens and Catherwood bought Copan for $50. Subsequently, they tried unsuccessfully to buy the ruins at Quirigua and Palenque. Stephens' claim was to take the ruins to New York to establish a museum of American antiquities. When an associate attempted to remove plaster casts of the monuments at Palenque, the residents insisted that he pay them $4,000 or $5,000 for the right to make duplicates of their monuments. He refused, and the casts were broken. When they returned to the United States, both Stephens and Catherwood hoped to make a profit financially from their travels. Catherwood opened a panorama to display Mayan antiquities as well as of engravings and watercolors. Unfortunately, everything was destroyed when the exhibit burned to the ground. Stephens' books were bestsellers in their day, and he profited immensely from their sale. Stephens and Catherwood were certainly not the first to see and exploit the commercial value of American antiquities. Squire had also attempted to sell the collection of mound builder artifacts he amassed in the 1840s. New voices were heard in the mound builder controversy in the 1850s. Schoolcraft decided that the mounds not need have been built by peoples with an advanced civilization, but could have been constructed by peoples at a barbarian level of culture. Samuel Haven, secretary of the American Antiquarian Society, which had been founded in 1812, echoed Schoolcraft's sentiments regarding the identity of the mound builders, pointing out that the mound contained no token of civil institutions, mechanical employments, and the cultivation of science and literature. In a word, he challenged the idea of a mound builder race. Haven also agreed with Schoolcraft's remarks about the absence of earthworks, mounds, and antiquities west of the Mississippi. At the time, when rights to landed property were being argued in the courts in terms of history of prior occupation, Haven and Schoolcraft were in effect denying that the Indian American tribes had any history of occupation in the region. To avoid muddying the waters even further on this issue, Haven did not mention the ruined pueblos that travelers were discovering in the American Southwest, or the contemporary inhabitants of the pueblos who farmed and hence had transformed the soil from an object of production to a means of production. News of the village Indians of the pueblos also came to the attention of Lewis Henry Morgan by the late 1850s. Morgan, a Rochester lawyer who had represented the Seneca Indians in a land dispute with the Ogden Land Company, wrote his famous League of the Iroquois. At the time when the stability of the Union was threatened by the growing rift between the North and South over slavery and capitalism, he was firmly committed to the political union of the two regions. He also believed that progress toward civilization was led by the stable middle class that meliorated the social system by the expansion of trade, industry, and education. Morgan's interest was drawn to the major issue of the day, the unity of the human species. Were human beings the members of a single racially diverse species, as some suggested, or were the various races different species, as Morton and others claimed? He set about resolving this debate in an ingenious way. In 1858, Morgan discovered that the Iroquois and the Ojibwa, who spoke distinct languages, had kinship systems that were identical in their fundamental characteristics. Over the next few years, he studied the kinship systems of other North American Indian tribes and eventually concluded that the systems of kinship terminology were essentially the same across the continent. This led him to conclude that the North American Indians had common origin. Following Schoolcraft and Haven, he thought that American Indians ultimately came from Asia and that their origins may lay among the Turanian speakers of that continent. To test the hypothesis, he asked an American missionary to prepare schedules of kin terms used by the Tamil people in the Dravidian tribes of South India. When he finally compared these schedules to those of the Iroquois, he concluded that the kinship structures were the same. This was conclusive proof, in Morgan's eyes, of the Asiatic origin of the American Indians. He would later write this in his Systems of Consanguinity and Affinity of the Human Family, that, when the discoverers of the New World bestowed upon its inhabitants the name of Indians, under the impression that they had reached the Indies, they little suspected that the children of the same original family, although upon a different continent, stood before them. In other words, there was a single diverse human species. Morgan further believed that the classificatory kinship systems shared by the peoples of South Asia and the Americas were an indication of their biological affinity. That is, culture and hereditary were linked. In an unpublished paper on animal psychology written in 1859, he argued not only for the unity of the human race, but also the unity of the human mind. He wrote that man, indeed, progresses in knowledge from generation to generation, but yet the limits of human understanding have not been advanced one hair's breadth between man's historical period. All the capacities of the entire race of man existed potentially in the first human pair. Notwithstanding, proportions of the human race have thus risen in heightness of civilization. Other portions, such as the Bushman and the Hottentot, still sit in the darkness of ignorance and intellectual imbecility. The Bushman, however, is of the human genus, and logically, the point of comparison between man and the species below him commences with the Bushman just as legitimately as with the European. What distinguished Bushmen from Europeans, in Morgan's view, was more their respective levels of social development than their physical appearance or race. The hunting and foraging mode of subsistence of the Bushmen was characteristic of savagery, the earlier primitive stage of humanity. The Europeans were civilized, that is, they had attained a higher stage of social development in which their subsistence needs were stratified by farming, animal husbandry, and fishing, and they wrote and kept records. For most of human history, however, people remained at the state of savagery. While our savage ancestors provided the foundation for human progress by stabilizing subsistence needs and developing language, they nevertheless remained underdeveloped and inferior when compared to civilized people. Morgan believed that progress, the movement of one stage to the next, resulted from technological innovations that transformed the modes of subsistence to the kinds of social institutions that were inexorably linked with them. In a letter to Joseph Henry of the Smithsonian Institution, he wrote that the real epochs of progress were connected with the arts of subsistence that concludes the Darwinian idea of the struggle for existence. In his view, the dietary improvements that ensued fueled both physical expansion of the brain and improvements in beliefs in social institutions. In ancient society, Morgan referred to this as the growth of intelligence through invention and discovery. He described the process in more detail. Without enlarging the basis of subsistence, mankind could not have propagated themselves into other areas not possessing the same kinds of food and ultimately over the whole surface of earth, without obtaining an absolute control over both its variety and amount. They could not have multiplied into populous nations. This is accordingly probably that the great epochs of human progress have been identified, more or less directly, with the enlargement of sources of subsistence. Furthermore, such progress, he argued, was substantially the same kind in tribes and nations inhabiting different, even disconnected continents, while in the same status, with deviations of uniformity, in particular instances produced by special causes. The argument, when extended, tends to establish the unity of origin of mankind. This was certainly a different argument from those of polygenists like Morton or Squire, for example, who claimed that 1. The inequalities in technological development found among different peoples were a consequence of differences in their innate abilities, and 2. That these abilities were immutable. Morgan used an evolutionary theory of change to describe human progress, the movement from savagery through barbarism to civilization. He used both archaeological and ethnological information to construct and describe the movement of human society from one stage of development, or ethnical period, as he called them, to the next. Each stage was marked by the appearance of particular inventions, such as pottery, plant and animal domestication for barbarism, and writing and records for civilization. Other institutions, such as monogamous marriage or private property, he believed, only appeared after civilization had already been achieved. While he used the idea of stages of development to organize his argument, Morgan was actually more concerned with the process underlying the shift from savagery through barbarism to civilization than with the sequence in which those changes actually occurred. He was also acutely aware that institutions would continue to change in the future as society itself changed. The rise of civilization, in Morgan's view, was ultimately the product of a series of fortuitous circumstances. Its attainment at some time was certain, but that it should have been accomplished when it was, still an extraordinary fact, that it may well serve to remind us that we owe our present condition, with its multiple means of safety and happiness, to struggles, the sufferings, the heroic exertions, and the patent toil of our barbarous and more remotely of our savage ancestors. Their labors, their trials, and their successes were part of a plan of the supreme intelligence to develop the barbarian out of a savage and a civilized man out of this barbarian. Morgan also employed a concept of uneven social development. He thought that any given moment in time, some peoples more advanced than others, and that tribes either advanced by borrowing from the more developed culture, or they were held back by their geographical isolation and circumstances, like many of his time. He also believed that Indo-European and Semitic speakers of Europe and the Mediterranean were the most advanced peoples of the time. By the commingling of diverse stocks, superiority of subsistence or advantage of position, and possibly altogether, they were the first to emerge from barbarism. They were substantially the founders of civilization, but their existence as distinct families was undoubtedly, in a comparative sense, a late event. Their progenitors were lost in undistinguishable mass of earlier barbarians. The most advanced portion of the human race were halted, so to express it, at certain stages of progress, until some great invention or discovery, such as the domestication of animals or the smelting of iron ore, gave a new and powerful impulse forward. While thus restrained, the ruder tribes, continually advancing, approached in different degrees of nearness to the same status. For wherever a continental connection existed, all the tribes must have shared in some measure in each other's progress. All great inventions and discoveries propagate themselves, but the inferior tribes must have appreciated their value before they could appropriate them. In the continental areas, certain tribes would lead, but the leadership would be apt to shift a number of times in the course of an ethnical period. Morgan further believed that there was a functional relation between economy and the form of the political organization. This transformed from a social to a political organization occurred when agriculture and herding became productive enough to allow people to live in cities and to acquire private property. Using classical Greece as a case, he argued that the civil powers gradually withdrawn from the kin-based units, such as clans, were reinvested in institutions such as military commanders or municipal magistrates, associated with the newly territorial-based constituencies. In his words, the city brought with it new demands in the art of government by creating a changed condition in society. Morgan argued that the early forms of political organization were based on personal rather than political ties. It was only after societies became territorially based, a process that began with the advent of agriculture, that the first steps towards political organization occurred. Clans that restricted the number of possible marriage partners were followed by chiefs and tribal councils, by tribal confederacies, then by nations with divisions between council of chiefs and assemblies of people. And finally, out of military necessities of the United Tribes came the military commander. Two other changes were also linked functionally with the shift from a socially to a territorially based political organization and the development of property. They were increasingly importance of the monogamous patrilineal family and the diminished status of women. The centrality and dominance of men in the patriarchal family, the complete control they had over household, and their ability to isolate its members from a larger society placed severe restrictions on their participation of women in decision-making. Morgan discussed the growth of private property in the final part of ancient society. On one hand, he believed that social classes were disappearing in the United States. On the other, he suggested that it was left to then distant period of civilization to develop into full vitality, that the greed of gain, which is now a commanding force in the human mind. While he thought progress was ultimately both inevitable and beneficial, Morgan also believed that the rise of civilization had, in fact, destroyed something valuable, the values of those past and present-day peoples who neither knew private property nor the profit motive. He wrote that, since the advent of civilization, the outgrowth of property has been so immense, its forms so diversified, that it uses so expanding, and its management so intelligent in the interest of its owners, that it has become, on the part of the people, an unmanageable power. The human mind stands bewildered in the presence of its own creation. The time will come, nevertheless, when human intelligence will rise to the mastery over property and define the relations of the state to the property it protects, as well as the obligations of the limits to the rights of owners. The interests of society are paramount to individual interests, and the two must be brought into just and harmonious relations. A mere property career is not the final destiny of mankind. If progress is to be the law of the future, it has been of the past. The time which passed away since civilization began is but a fragment of the past duration of man's existence, but a fragment of ages yet to come. The dissolution of society bids fair to become the termination of a career which property is the end and aim, because which a career contains the elements of self-destruction, democracy in government, brotherhood in society, equal rights and privileges, the universal education, foreshadow in the higher plan of society, to which experience, intelligence, and knowledge are steadily tending. It will be revival in a higher form of the liberty, equality, fraternity of ancient gents. In 1878, Morgan traveled to the Southwest, where he visited existing pueblos and studied the ruins of several abandoned ones. The trip had important consequences. First, the pueblos demonstrated, in his view, the existence of primitive communism, that is, societies in which the nuclear family survives only because it is part of the larger unit that is held together by equitable sharing of resources. He also thought that the archaeological remains found by Stephens and others in Guatemala and the Yucatan also showed the existence of primitive communism. Second, convinced of the importance of the American Southwest as a laboratory and potential window on development into ancient society, Morgan and Frederick Ward Putnam, the director of Harvard's Peabody Museums of American Archaeology and Ethnology, attempted to persuade Charles Eliot Norton, chairman of newly founded Archaeological Institute of America, to commit funds to study Indian architecture from the Pueblos to the Isthmus of Darien. After lengthy discussions, the Institute agreed to hire Adolph Bandelier to conduct an archaeological and historical investigations of the American Southwest. Third, at the suggestion of Henry Adams, Morgan urged John Wesley Powell, director of newly established U.S. Geological Survey and Bureau of American Ethnology, to initiate ethnological studies of Indian tribes at the western of the United States. Morgan had been concerned with the plight of American Indians since his legal work for the Seneca in the 1840s. As the western frontier began to close, he began to turn his attention to their circumstances in western territories. In 1862, he urged President Abraham Lincoln to no avail to set aside lands for 2 Indian territories west of the Mississippi River. After Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn, Morgan reiterated his views in The Nation. He described the failure of the country's Indian policy since the Jacksonian era and criticized the government genocidal war against the Dakota tribes. Who shall we blame for the Sioux for defending themselves, their wives, and their children, when attacked in their own encampment and threatened with destruction? Before the summer is over, we may expect to hear of the destruction of the great body of these unreasoning and unreasonable Indians who refuse to treat for the surrender of their lands upon terms they do not approve, and whose extermination may be regarded by some as merited punishment. The good name of the country cannot bear many wars of this description. In 1877, he renewed his request to President Rutherford B. Haynes to establish Indian territories west of the Mississippi River, again to no avail. 8 years earlier, in 1869, civil rights advocate Cora Daniels Tappan had described the thrust of the government's policies more terrously and perceptively in the Boston Gazette. She wrote, "A government that has for nearly a century enslaved one race, African, that prescribes another, Chinese, proposes to exterminate another, Indian, and persistently refuses to recognize the rights of one half of its citizens, women, cannot justly be called perfect." Tappan described the social circumstances in which anthropology was born and nurtured in the United States.